They say blood is thicker than water, but in American business, greed turns blood into deadly poison. I trusted family until my uncle and his son turned my father's funeral into a silent celebration. They plotted to steal our tech empire, leaving me with nothing. They wanted it all. So I smiled, took one step back, and gave them exactly what they craved. They just did not know the crown I surrendered was actually a perfectly tied noose. Hello, wonderful listeners of James' Revenge Stories. YouTube has unfortunately demonetized our channel, leaving us without a budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff to sustain their livelihoods and continue creating these stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or pinned comment below. My name is Madeline Rice. I am 32 years old, and until recently, I was the lead systems engineer at Verdant Core Dynamics. We were a pioneering biotech and advanced water filtration startup based in the relentlessly gray, rain-slicked heart of Seattle, Washington. Seattle is a city that runs on high-grade espresso and raw, unyielding intellectual labor. It is a place where you either build something real with your own two hands, or you eventually get washed away in the endless downpour. My father, Arthur Rice, was undeniably a builder. He was a dry, socially awkward engineering genius who always preferred the deep hum of server racks and the sterile, sharp smell of the laboratory over any form of human interaction. For 20 years, he poured his entire soul into developing a proprietary biofiltration core. It was a revolutionary biological algorithm paired with physical filtration meshes, a system on the verge of turning the entire global water purification industry on its head. He was not a man of many words, but his relentless work ethic spoke volumes. I worked right alongside him, matching his grueling long hours, writing the complex system codes, and turning his abstract blueprints into tangible reality. We were a perfect, silent team. Then, there were the shadows. My uncle Richard, my father's younger brother, and his son Julian. If my father and I represented the calloused hands and tired eyes of true innovation, Richard and Julian were the perfectly manicured parasites who fed on it. They were Ivy League graduates who wore imported tailored suits that cost more than my first car. They possessed a remarkable, almost terrifying talent for using the respected Rice family name to secure reservations at exclusive restaurants and useless advisory seats on pointless charity boards. Yet, in their entire privileged lives, neither of them had ever built a single thing of actual value. They were professional talkers, smooth operators always hovering around the edges of my father's hard-earned success, waiting for scraps to fall from the table. The tragedy did not strike us like a sudden lightning bolt. It crept in slowly, like a thick fog rolling off the Puget Sound. It started with minor things like misplaced office keys, completely forgotten vendor appointments, and crucial code configurations left half-finished on his monitors. Then came the devastating diagnosis. Arthur was suffering from a rapidly progressing form of neurodegenerative disease and severe dementia. The brilliant, razor-sharp mind that had meticulously mapped out complex biological matrices was suddenly struggling to remember the basic route home from the office he had driven to for over a decade. The very moment the medical diagnosis was confirmed, the vultures began to circle. Richard and Julian, who previously only bothered to visit Seattle when they needed a substantial business loan, suddenly packed their expensive leather bags and relocated to our city. They immediately cast themselves in the role of the tragically devoted, self-sacrificing family members. They hovered around my father's house constantly, bringing overpriced organic teas he could not even taste, and reading thick historical biographies aloud that his deteriorating brain could no longer process. "We are here for you, Arthur. You just rest now," Richard would say, placing a heavy, possessive hand on my father's increasingly frail shoulder. Julian would always chime in, looking at me with a sickeningly sweet, condescending smile. "You focus on the lab work, Maddie. We will take care of the old man. Family takes care of family." But their sudden, overwhelming devotion was a meticulously constructed barricade. They were systematically isolating him from me. I was spending 14 to 16 hours a day at the research facility, desperately trying to finalize the filtration core before my father completely lost his grasp on reality, and the company panicked. When I finally came home, exhausted to my bones, Richard was always standing at the door, physically blocking the way to the master bedroom. He would whisper harshly that Arthur had just fallen into a deep sleep and absolutely should not be disturbed. I started noticing the glaring discrepancies. Thick financial folders from the home office were suddenly missing or completely reorganized in ways my father never would have allowed. I saw unfamiliar, sleek black luxury sedans parked discreetly in our driveway during working hours. I caught brief glimpses of closed-door meetings in the living room between Richard and a sharp-featured, ruthless-looking man I later learned was his private attorney. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to kick them out into the Seattle rain, to tear up whatever legal papers they were quietly shoving under my father's confused, uncomprehending eyes. But I looked at my father. On the rare, brief occasions I was actually allowed to sit by his bed, he looked so incredibly tired, yet strangely calm. In his fading mind, he truly believed his estranged brother was finally stepping up to be a real family. The doctors told me he had less than 6 months left, so I made a choice. I swallowed my burning anger. I buried my dark suspicions deep down, and I chose absolute, agonizing silence. I let them play their cruel game, quietly enduring their thinly veiled insults and their aggressive territorial control over the house, just so my father could spend his final days in an environment free of violent screaming matches and ugly legal threats. I gave him the peace he deserved. But in the cold silence of my own office, late at night, I began to prepare for war. My father finally stopped breathing on a bitterly cold Tuesday night. It was the kind of evening where the unforgiving Seattle rain did not just fall, but violently lashed against the hospital window panes like a barrage of icy bullets. When the flatline tone echoed through the sterile room, a heavy, deafening finality settled over everything. The funeral took place 3 days later, and it transformed into a grotesque theatrical performance designed exclusively for the technology press. Flashbulbs from industry reporters pierced the miserable gray morning as Richard and Julian executed their carefully rehearsed roles with sickening perfection. Richard stood by the mahogany casket holding a massive black umbrella, periodically dabbing his completely dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Julian, meanwhile, offered tragic, photogenic profiles to the cameras, shaking hands and accepting condolences with the solemn gravity of a newly crowned prince. I stood several paces behind them, letting the rain soak entirely through my dark wool coat, feeling an absolute, hollow numbness. Exactly 72 hours after the burial, the charade shifted from the graveyard to a battleground. I received a sharp, formally worded email summoning me to a towering glass and steel skyscraper in downtown Bellevue. It was a flashy, aggressively modern corporate district that felt worlds away from the gritty, functional laboratories where my father and I had spent our lives. I was directed to the penthouse floor, stepping into a sprawling conference room that smelled of expensive leather, fresh floor wax, and raw ambition. Waiting for me at the head of a massive marble table was Marcus Thorne. He was Richard's private attorney, a man whose sharply tailored charcoal suit and slicked-back hair screamed of high-priced billable hours and ruthless corporate takeovers. Thorne did not bother to stand when I entered. He gestured vaguely toward a chair with his expensive fountain pen, wearing a patronizing, razor-thin smile that immediately set my blood on fire. Richard and Julian sat to his right, looking like predators comfortably resting after a highly successful hunt. "Let us keep this brief and professional, Madeline," Thorne began, his voice dripping with practiced condescension. "We are here to formally execute the final will and testament of Arthur Rice. As you are likely aware, your father made significant revisions to his estate planning very recently." He slid a thick, legally bound document across the polished marble. I did not need to touch it to know what it contained, but the date printed boldly on the top page made my stomach twist into a tight knot. It was signed and notarized exactly 3 weeks before my father's death. 3 weeks. That was right in the middle of the darkest period of his cognitive decline, a time when my father could not even successfully identify his own reflection in the bathroom mirror, let alone comprehend the dense, convoluted legal jargon of a corporate transfer. Thorne adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and began to read the critical clauses aloud, making sure to enunciate every devastating blow. According to the document, Arthur Rice, supposedly of sound mind and clear judgment, had transferred 100% of the controlling shares of Verdant Core Dynamics to his beloved brother, Richard Rice, and his nephew, Julian Rice. This comprehensive transfer included every single company bank account, the physical laboratories, the manufacturing facilities, and total executive control over the board of directors. And regarding your position, Madeline, Thorne continued, his eyes darting up to gauge my reaction. Your father wished to acknowledge your past contributions. You are hereby awarded a one-time severance sum of $25,000. Furthermore, you will be granted the title of honorary advisor. However, this title carries no voting rights, no executive authority, and no continued salary. Finally, as the new controlling owners intend to completely restructure the engineering department, you are formally requested to vacate your current office and clear out all personal belongings within 48 hours. They had taken everything. The legacy my father bled for, the technology I had spent my youth perfecting, the very company we'd built from the ground up, all swallowed whole by 2 men who did not even know how to write a single line of basic code. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The smugness radiating from him was almost physically suffocating. He was practically vibrating with anticipation, desperate for me to shatter. He wanted the screaming match. He wanted the bitter, hysterical tears. He wanted me to throw the heavy glass water pitcher across the room and threaten a massive, drawn-out lawsuit that his expensive lawyers could easily crush. It is nothing personal, Maddie, Julian mocked, his voice a soft, venomous purr. The tech industry requires aggressive, visionary leadership. Uncle Arthur finally realized you are just a lab technician, not a CEO. Do not make this harder than it has to be. Pack your little desk toys, take your severance check, and move on quietly. The silence that followed in the sprawling conference room was absolute. The 3 men stared at me, holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable emotional explosion. Instead, I experienced the first genuine moment of clarity I had felt in months. A strange, icy calm washed over my entire body, freezing any trace of sorrow or rage. I looked at Thorne's arrogant smirk, at Richard's feigned innocence, and finally, at Julian's hungry, pathetic desperation for a fight. I did not give them a single drop of the satisfaction they craved. I kept my face perfectly blank, an unreadable mask of absolute indifference. I placed my hands flat on the table, pushed my chair back, and stood up smoothly. I looked directly into Richard's eyes, then shifted my gaze to Julian. "Thank you for your time today, Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice steady, polite, and completely devoid of emotion. "Congratulations on your new acquisitions, Uncle Richard." Julian. Without waiting for a response, I turned my back on them and walked purposefully out of the room, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floor. I did not slam the heavy glass doors. I did not look back. I left them sitting in a stunned, confused silence, completely unaware that their total victory was nothing more than the first act of their own absolute destruction. I returned to the facility the very next morning, exactly as instructed. I brought a single cardboard box. It took me less than 30 minutes to pack away my entire professional life. A few framed photographs, a worn-out coffee mug, and a handful of specialized engineering reference books. I wiped my company laptop completely clean of my personal settings, placed it gently on the edge of the desk, and laid my blue security access badge right on top of it. As I walked down the main corridor toward the glass exit doors, Richard and Julian were already standing there, flanked by a trailing entourage of nervous junior executives. Julian was grinning so hard I thought his jaw might snap. He actually offered me a slow, sarcastic golf clap as I pushed through the turnstiles for the very last time. I just gave him a polite nod, got into my car, and drove away. It did not take long for the industry gossip to reach me. Through the grapevine of former colleagues and industry message boards, I watched Julian's grand performance unfold. He immediately commandeered my father's old executive suite. He brought in high-priced contractors to tear out the practical whiteboards and replace them with imported Italian leather sofas, abstract modern art pieces, and a ridiculous mahogany wet bar. But Julian's ambition was not to actually run Verdant Core Dynamics. Running a biotech firm required actual work, late nights, and a deep understanding of cellular biology. His goal was an immediate, highly lucrative exit. Within a week, he was aggressively shopping the company around. He hired a boutique public relations agency in downtown Seattle, reportedly paying them over $50,000 a month just to place flashy, buzzword-filled articles in top-tier tech magazines. Soon, he had hooked a massive fish, a multinational industrial conglomerate desperate to acquire green technology to offset their carbon footprint. The preliminary acquisition number floating around the tech blogs was staggering, $150 million. But the conglomerate was not foolish. They wanted to see aggressive growth potential before signing the final papers. They wanted to see a booming, rapidly expanding enterprise, not a quiet, methodical research lab. So Richard and Julian did what they always did. They gambled recklessly. To finance a massive, superficial expansion, they needed immediate liquid capital. They personally leveraged everything they owned. They took out second and third mortgages on their sprawling lakeside mansions. They put up their luxury vehicle collections and their personal investment portfolios as collateral to secure over $12 million in high-interest bridge loans. They doubled the sales force, hiring people who did not even understand the complex filtration product. They leased 2 entire floors of premium downtown office space that the company absolutely did not need, and they threw lavish catered parties for the conglomerate's scouting teams. They were inflating a massive, shiny balloon, entirely convinced that the $150 million payday would wipe their $12 million debt clean and leave them as legendary industry titans, while they were frantically burning through borrowed millions to polish a company they barely understood. I completely disappeared. I changed my phone number, packed up my car, and drove 3 hours east, deep into the Cascade Mountains. I rented a small, isolated wooden cabin surrounded by towering Douglas firs and a cold, rushing river. I cut myself off from the digital world. For the first 3 weeks, my daily schedule consisted entirely of mastering the art of sourdough bread baking and learning how to fly fish for rainbow trout. I wore oversized flannel shirts, chopped my own firewood, and sat on the porch sipping hot tea. I projected the ultimate image of a broken, defeated woman who had completely surrendered to her cruel fate and retreated to lick her wounds in the wilderness. They bought the act entirely. About halfway through the month, a bewildered courier finally managed to track down my remote cabin location to deliver a thick, certified legal packet from Marcus Thorne. It was a formal waiver of claims, a dense legal document ensuring I would never contest the final will or demand any future equity from the impending corporate sale. The attached cover letter, which I read on a remarkably weak cellular signal, was brief and dripping with arrogant victory. Returning this signed waiver will officially sever all your ties to the estate, which is the most prudent path forward for you, the letter read. It heavily implied it was the smart, safe thing for a defeated lab technician to do. I signed it immediately with a cheap plastic ballpoint pen, enclosed it in the return envelope, and handed it back to the courier without a single second of hesitation. Back in Seattle, Richard's legal team celebrated. They truly believed they had achieved a total, flawless victory without shedding a single drop of sweat. They had total control of the company, they had the massive corporate buyer firmly on the hook, and the pesky, problematic daughter had officially bowed out of the arena without a fight. The countdown clock began ticking loudly. The official merger signing ceremony was firmly set for the very last Friday of the month. It was shaping up to be a massive media event, preceded only by the standard, routine procedural step known in the corporate world as due diligence. It is the final, tedious phase where the acquiring corporation's elite legal team meticulously combs through every single contract, asset, and intellectual property filing to ensure the company they are buying actually owns what they claim to own. Julian and Richard were already busy picking out the custom paint colors for their new yachts. They were entirely blinded by the brilliant, intoxicating glow of $150 million, completely unaware of the devastating, inescapable storm waiting for them in the fine print. While I sat on the porch of my isolated mountain cabin watching the river flow, my mind did not dwell on my uncle or his pathetic son. Instead, it constantly drifted back to a freezing, windswept night exactly 9 months prior. It was a time when my father was just beginning to show the very first subtle tremors of his illness. He might have misplaced a favorite pen or forgotten a lunch appointment, but his highly analytical mind, the ultimate processor that had built our entire empire, was still running at absolute peak efficiency. We were working late, running a routine diagnostic check on the main server architecture, when I noticed a bizarre data packet routing through our secure internal firewall. It was a tiny anomaly, but in systems engineering, anomalies are the loudest alarms. I dug deeper. It was not an external hack from a rival corporation. The breach was coming from inside our own building. I meticulously traced the digital footprints and found they belonged to 3 of our most trusted mid-level network administrators. They were quietly and systematically duplicating the raw architectural blueprints of our proprietary biological matrix. I set up a silent monitoring protocol. Within 48 hours, I intercepted a highly encrypted email thread. The destination address belonged to Richard. My uncle was not just patiently waiting for my father's memory to fade. He was actively accelerating his own hostile takeover. He was paying off our own staff with thousands of dollars in offshore accounts to clone our most sensitive research. His strategy was clear. He wanted the raw data so he could hold the company hostage, or replicate the technology entirely if my father ever refused to hand over executive control. I printed the access logs and laid them flat on my father's desk. I fully expected him to fly into a rage, to call the local authorities, and to march those traitors out of the lobby in handcuffs. Instead, Arthur Rice simply adjusted his reading glasses, calmly reviewed the lines of code, and let out a dry, completely humorless chuckle. "A fortress is never breached from the outside, Maddie," he said, his voice terrifyingly steady and cold. "It is always someone opening the gates from within." I wanted to sue Richard into oblivion. I wanted to drag his pristine name through the mud of a public courtroom. But my father stopped me. He pointed out the fatal flaw in my anger. If we fired the spies, Richard would instantly know we were onto him and change his tactics. If we sued my uncle, the ensuing legal circus would tank the company's market valuation, scare off our primary investors, and tie up our life's work in discovery hearings for the next 5 years. My father despised messy, emotional conflicts. He preferred elegant mathematical solutions. We needed to protect our core asset without ever letting the enemy know that the locks on the vault had been changed. The very next weekend, under the convenient guise of attending a remarkably boring biotechnology symposium, my father and I boarded a private flight out of Seattle. We flew nearly 2,000 miles east across the country to Chicago. We were not going to see a top-tier neurologist. We were going to see Evelyn Vance. In the cutthroat, hyper-aggressive world of corporate intellectual property law, Evelyn Vance was considered a legal assassin. Her office, situated high above the freezing, violent winds of Lake Michigan, was a monument to calculated aggression, designed entirely in brushed steel and black marble. She did not offer us warm pleasantries or cups of coffee. She simply looked at the encrypted hard drive my father placed on her massive desk. "You want to protect the asset?" Evelyn stated, cutting straight through the silence. My father nodded slowly. "My brother wants to steal the company," he explained softly. "I want to make sure that when he finally takes it, he chokes on it." Evelyn smiled. It was a brilliant, terrifying expression. Over the next 2 hours, she explained a fundamental concept that forms the absolute bedrock of modern technological warfare. People, especially arrogant amateurs like Richard and Julian, often confuse the physical shell of a company with its actual soul. Verdant Core Dynamics, as a registered corporate entity, owned the expensive laboratory equipment, the glass beakers, the imported office chairs, and the millions of dollars in the business bank accounts. But the code, the complex biological algorithm that made the water filtration core actually function, that was intellectual property. And intellectual property is an entirely separate, highly mobile entity. Over the next 72 hours in that freezing Chicago office, Evelyn orchestrated an absolute masterpiece of legal restructuring. We did not change a single, solitary detail about the ownership structure of Verdant Core Dynamics. If Richard ever managed to manipulate a new will and steal the corporate shares, he would find the company ledger perfectly intact. Instead, we performed a surgical extraction of the company's soul. My father legally and permanently transferred the absolute ownership of the core algorithm, the base source code, and all associated global patents into a newly formed, heavily shielded private entity called the Rice Innovation Trust. I was legally named the sole executor and the single, irrevocable beneficiary of that trust. But how could our company continue to operate without owning its own technology? This is where Evelyn's genius truly shone. She drafted an ironclad licensing agreement. The Rice Innovation Trust graciously leased the right to use the biological algorithm back to Verdant Core Dynamics. The company paid a completely nominal licensing fee of exactly $1 every single year. To anyone looking at the daily operations or the basic balance sheets, absolutely nothing had changed. The servers hummed, the filters purified water, and the business continued to grow rapidly. Furthermore, Evelyn deliberately categorized this lease under standard operational vendor contracts, ensuring it would remain buried deep beneath thousands of pages of mundane supply agreements, completely invisible to anyone who did not know exactly what they were looking for. But buried deep within the fine print of that 70-page licensing contract was a standard, yet utterly lethal termination clause. Evelyn called it the dead man's switch. The lease was strictly non-transferable. The agreement clearly stipulated that the license to use the intellectual property would immediately and automatically terminate forever upon 2 highly specific conditions. Condition 1, any change in the majority ownership of Verdant Core Dynamics. Condition 2, the death or medical incapacitation of Arthur Rice. We returned to Seattle early Monday morning. My father greeted Richard with a warm, brotherly embrace in the hallway. I went back to my server room, working right alongside the network administrators I knew were actively betraying us. We let them steal the useless data. We let Richard plot his grand takeover. We let Julian dream of his massive corporate payout. We let them painstakingly weave their own ropes, because my father and I knew a fundamental, undeniable truth about the modern world. When you steal a high-performance vehicle, it does you absolutely no good if the engine has already been legally removed, dismantled, and locked inside a vault 2,000 miles away. All you are left with is a very heavy, extremely expensive metal box. The climax of their grand, arrogant delusion took place on the 40th floor of the most exclusive, hyper-modern commercial skyscraper in downtown Seattle. It was a Friday morning, precisely the day the massive corporate merger was scheduled to be signed, sealed, and celebrated. Outside the floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows, a relentless, heavy Seattle rainstorm violently lashed against the reinforced glass, turning the entire city below into a blurry sea of gray. But inside that sprawling, climate-controlled executive boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with intoxicating warmth, the scent of expensive cologne, and the palpable, vibrating energy of pure, unadulterated greed. Julian and Richard had dressed for a coronation. Julian wore a custom-tailored, imported navy blue suit that clung perfectly to his frame, paired with a silk tie that practically screamed of new money. He was practically bouncing on his expensive Italian leather chair, a man who believed he was mere minutes away from grasping $150 million. Richard sat beside him, projecting the faux gravity of a seasoned industry titan, repeatedly checking the heavy, diamond-encrusted gold watch he had undoubtedly purchased on credit just days prior. At the center of the massive mahogany table sat a silver bucket overflowing with crushed ice, holding 2 bottles of extraordinarily rare vintage champagne, waiting to be violently popped the second the final signatures dried. Sitting directly across from my family members was the elite acquisition team sent by the buying conglomerate. They were a row of incredibly serious, gray-haired men and women in dark, conservative suits. They did not share Julian's manic excitement. To them, this was not a lottery win. It was a cold, calculated transaction. Leading their team was their senior executive counsel, a hardened corporate veteran with sharp, unforgiving eyes and a posture that commanded absolute authority in any room he entered. Marcus Thorne, acting as the supreme architect of my uncle's supposed victory, stood up and smoothed the lapels of his charcoal blazer. He wore a sickeningly smug, self-satisfied smile as he dramatically slid a massive, leather-bound binder across the polished wood. "Gentlemen," Thorne announced, his voice dripping with absolute confidence, "enclosed is the final, comprehensive due diligence report. As you will see, Verdant Core Dynamics is in completely flawless legal standing. Every single financial audit is immaculate. Our aggressive expansion strategy over the last month has perfectly positioned the company for your global manufacturing capabilities. The board has unanimously approved the sale. All that remains is for your legal department to verify the final federal property schedules, and we can proceed to the signing." The lead counsel for the conglomerate did not smile. He simply nodded curtly, opened the heavy binder, and began to meticulously flip through the dense pages. This is the exact moment where the pacing of the universe seemed to drastically slow down. Every single second stretched into an eternity. Julian leaned forward, his fingers drumming a rapid, anxious rhythm against the table. Richard took a long, slow sip from his crystal water glass. Thorne stood proudly near the window, gazing out at the rainy skyline like a conquering general admiring his newly acquired territory. The lead counsel reached the final section of the binder, the intellectual property appendix. What Thorne and Julian fundamentally did not understand was that federal patent and intellectual property databases operate on a strictly automated, deeply interconnected digital framework. Exactly 1 hour before this meeting began, the sophisticated legal software Evelyn Vance utilized in Chicago had triggered the final lethal mechanism of our trap. The moment the formal intent to sell the majority shares of Verdant Core Dynamics was officially registered in the federal system, the dead man's switch my father and I had painstakingly built was instantaneously activated. The licensing agreement shattered. The rights vanished. The lead counsel's eyes tracked across the freshly updated federal addendum. Suddenly, his index finger stopped moving. The rhythmic sound of his turning pages abruptly ceased. He frowned, a deep, severe crease forming between his eyebrows. He leaned closer to the dense text, his eyes darting back and forth across the same paragraph 3 distinct times. The casual administrative boredom completely vanished from his face, replaced instantly by a chilling, razor-sharp intensity. The silence in the boardroom grew incredibly heavy. The soft, ambient hum of the ventilation system suddenly sounded deafening. "Is there an issue with the formatting, counsel?" Thorne asked, a tiny, almost imperceptible sliver of hesitation finally bleeding into his arrogant tone. The lead counsel slowly raised his head. He reached up, deliberately removed his thick reading glasses, and folded them with a sharp, echoing snap. He stared directly across the table, his gaze locking onto Marcus Thorne with the absolute disgust one might reserve for a common street scammer. "Mr. Thorne," the lead counsel began, his voice dangerously low, slicing through the warm room like a blade of solid ice. "Are you attempting to perpetrate a federal fraud against my organization?" Richard choked slightly on his water. Julian's manic drumming instantly stopped. "Fraud?" Julian scoffed, his voice cracking slightly with sudden, unexpected panic. "What are you talking about? The company is spotless." The lead lawyer ignored Julian entirely. He kept his furious eyes fixed strictly on Thorne. He picked up the heavy sheet of paper, held it up, and read the fatal sentence aloud, enunciating every single terrifying syllable with devastating clarity. According to the automated Federal Registry update executed at 9 o'clock this morning, Verdant Core Dynamics does not possess any operational or exploitation rights to the biofiltration matrix core. All licensing and intellectual property rights have been permanently revoked and reverted entirely to the Rice Innovation Trust, managed exclusively by Ms. Madeline Rice. The atmosphere in the room completely shattered. It was as if a massive, invisible vacuum had suddenly sucked every single molecule of oxygen out of the air. Marcus Thorne practically lunged across the mahogany table. He violently snatched the paper from the counsel's hand, his eyes bulging as he desperately scanned the words. Within exactly 3 seconds, the arrogant, slick attorney turned a ghastly, translucent shade of gray. His jaw dropped slightly. A thick bead of cold sweat instantly materialized on his forehead. He tried to speak, to offer some brilliant legal counterargument, but his throat only produced a pathetic, strangled gasp. Julian stared at Thorne, sheer terror finally bleeding through his expensive suit. His hand began to violently tremble. The heavy, gold-plated fountain pen he had been holding, the pen he brought specifically to sign away my father's legacy for $150 million, slipped through his suddenly numb fingers. It hit the polished mahogany table with a sharp, heavy clatter and rolled slowly onto the carpet. "Marcus!" Richard demanded, his voice rising to a frantic, high-pitched shout. "Marcus, what does that mean? What did he just read? Tell them it is a clerical error." Thorne did not answer. He simply dropped the paper onto the table as if it were burning his skin. The conglomerate's lead counsel stood up violently, pushing his heavy leather chair back so hard it crashed into the wall behind him. The entire acquisition team immediately mirrored his movement, aggressively slamming their briefcases shut in perfect, furious synchronization. "It means, Mr. Rice," the lead counsel spat, his voice echoing with righteous corporate fury, "that you do not own a technology company. You own a completely hollow, worthless shell. You own office furniture and laboratory glassware. The actual filtration algorithm, the only single asset my conglomerate was willing to pay for, does not belong to you. This entire negotiation is a complete sham." "Wait, please," Julian begged, shooting up from his chair, his voice cracking entirely. "We can fix this. She is just a disgruntled former employee. We can sue her. We can tie her up in court. My organization does not purchase active multi-million-dollar intellectual property lawsuits," the senior lawyer fired back, grabbing his coat. "We buy clean assets. You have entirely wasted our time. This acquisition is permanently terminated. If you ever attempt to contact our board of directors again, I will personally ensure the Securities and Exchange Commission formally investigates you for intentional corporate fraud." The buyers marched toward the exit, leaving a wake of absolute devastation behind them. As the lead counsel aggressively pulled open the heavy, frosted glass doors of the boardroom, he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks, stepping aside to make way for the 2 people standing patiently in the outer hallway. I walked into the boardroom. I was not wearing an imported designer gown or a flashy luxury watch. I wore a simple, sharply tailored gray suit. My hair was tied back tightly. Beside me walked Evelyn Vance, carrying a slender black leather briefcase, her expression radiating the calm, terrifying confidence of an apex predator observing a freshly trapped prey. I did not gloat. I did not sneer. I simply walked over to the opposite side of the table, looking directly into the shattered, hyperventilating faces of my uncle and my cousin. The silence I brought with me was far heavier, far more suffocating than any screaming match they could have ever prepared for. I was completely relaxed, completely in control, and ready to deliver the final blow. The moment the heavy frosted glass doors clicked shut behind the departing acquisition team, Richard completely lost his mind. He violently slammed both of his fists onto the mahogany table, his face turning a dangerous, suffocating shade of crimson. "You little thief!" he screamed, pointing a violently trembling finger directly at my face. "I will sue you into absolute oblivion. I will have you thrown into a federal prison for corporate fraud. You cannot just steal a company from its rightful legal owners." Evelyn Vance barely even blinked. She calmly stepped forward, unlatched her slender black leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick, heavily stamped stack of legal documents. She placed them gently onto the polished wood. "There is absolutely no fraud here, Richard," Evelyn stated, her tone as casual and relaxed as if she were ordering a midday coffee. "These are the deeply authenticated, federally notarized records of the intellectual property transfer. They were officially executed exactly 9 months ago, personally signed by Arthur Rice during a period when multiple medical records definitively prove he was of completely sound mind. Furthermore, all state and federal transfer taxes have been paid in full. If you attempt to file a lawsuit, my firm will happily countersue you for malicious prosecution, and I promise you, I will legally strip away whatever pennies you happen to have left." The fight completely drained out of Julian. He collapsed back into his expensive Italian leather chair, burying his pale face in his trembling hands. The devastating, inescapable reality of their financial situation was finally crashing down upon them with the weight of a collapsing building. Without the $150 million payout from the conglomerate, they had absolutely no way to cover the $12 million in high-interest bridge loans they had recklessly taken out to inflate the company's appearance. Their sprawling lakeside mansions, their exotic luxury car collections, their entire personal investment portfolios, everything they had arrogantly used as collateral was now entirely forfeit. They were not just walking away empty-handed. They were facing absolute catastrophic bankruptcy. They were weeks away from losing their own homes. I stepped forward, reaching deep into my own jacket pocket. I pulled out a single, crisp sheet of paper and slid it across the table, resting it right over Marcus Thorne's entirely useless due diligence report. Right next to the paper, I placed a single, slightly wrinkled $1 bill. "What is this?" Richard whispered, his voice completely broken and incredibly hollow. "It is a lifeline," I replied coldly. "You currently own a bloated corporate shell that is actively bleeding money and drowning in new debt. In exactly 1 week, the massive creditors will come to seize all of your personal assets. I am generously offering to buy 100% of the controlling shares of Verdant Core Dynamics from you, right here and right now, for exactly $1. I am entirely willing to take on the massive corporate liabilities so you do not have to, solely because I refuse to let you drag my father's respected name through a public bankruptcy court." Julian slowly looked at the single green dollar bill resting on the table. The sheer irony was physically suffocating. They had aggressively aimed for the stars, fueled entirely by boundless greed. And now their only possible escape from total financial ruin was to sell their stolen empire for literal pocket change. They had absolutely no other choice. With visibly shaking hands, Richard picked up his fallen gold pen and signed his name on the dotted line. Julian silently and blindly followed. They stood up without uttering a single word and walked out of the room, leaving the skyscraper with exactly zero. The very next morning, I walked back through the front doors of the Verdant Core Dynamics facility. I did not carry a sad little cardboard box. I walked straight up to the executive floor, sat comfortably at my father's old practical wooden desk, and logged directly into the secure mainframe. With just a few swift keystrokes, I reactivated the licensing protocols, permanently linking the Rice Innovation Trust back to the active corporate servers. By noon, the entire production facility was beautifully humming back to life, and the jobs of over 300 dedicated employees were securely and permanently saved. I stood silently by the massive window of the executive office, watching the relentless Seattle rain gently wash over the busy city below. I held a warm ceramic mug of black coffee, completely bitter with absolutely no sugar, exactly the way my father used to drink it. I took a slow sip and smiled in pure satisfaction. I finally understood that a true legacy is never just written on a fragile piece of paper or handed down in a forged legal will. True legacy lives permanently in the sharp intellect you cultivate, the grueling hard work you endure, and the ruthless, brilliant preparation you are entirely willing to execute just to protect the people and the things you love. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Please let me know down in the comments. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider helping us with just a $1 donation. You can easily scan the PayPal QR code currently on your screen or use the secure PayPal link provided in the description or the pinned comment below. Your generous support directly allows us to pay our dedicated staff so they can comfortably feed their families and continue bringing you more incredible stories exactly like this one. Thank you again, and stay safe.